climate change obsession or climate change fixation prevented us from paying attention to real threats like coronavirus. So when this crisis started emerging, I remembered I was as part of a chapter, and I think chapter 10 in the new moral case for fossil fuels. I'd been writing about this kind of idea, and so I talked about here's a quote. Now it might change in the final version, but I talked about climate myopia, which may better be called climate fixation. So here's a quote: "Climate myopia, wherein we treat stopping climate change as the most important issue, causes us to ignore far more pressing concerns and will surely blind us to unknown ones going forward." And then I have later, "Finally, as a culture, we need to end climate change as an obsession. For one, human empowerment needs to be a positive priority." And then I have some more on that. But then I have, "There are many other real concerns that we are almost completely ignoring because we think that a couple degrees of change in the average temperatures around the globe is somehow going to prevent us from sustaining and enjoying our lives." And then I talked about antibiotic resistance, so the phenomenon of bacteria that can go against antibiotics, but it's very closely related to viruses. And it's just a fact that you cannot focus on everything. And if the whole society and the whole culture is fixated on climate, that is going to take their focus off other things. And there's a really good interview with a guy I know named Amish Adalja, who's an expert on infectious diseases. He did it with Sam Harris. And if you listen to the end of the interview, maybe the last 10 or 20 minutes, he talks about just how people in that community have been warning for years that we are ill prepared for different kinds of pandemics. And yet that gets no attention. Or it used to get no attention. So what happens is it gets no attention until it needs attention, and then it gets a huge amount of attention, but we're ill prepared. So what needs to happen is we need to be thinking about things from a human flourishing perspective and really be aware of and encourage people to be aware of a wide spectrum of threats to human flourishing as well as a wide spectrum of opportunities, and not have this fixation on one thing. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, so, I mean, one objection or one relevant claim that I've heard from climate catastrophists is kind of goes in the other direction, where their argument is, well, look, here's a case where people predicted catastrophe and they were right. And so, that implies that we should be believed and listen to the catastrophists on climate. Now, I'll be interested in your response to that, Alex, but just one point that I'd like to point out is, I mean, it's not even clear that the, COVID-19, certainly the people who are saying that we needed to make preparations for a pandemic, I think have been proven right. But if we're talking about the kind of catastrophic claims that basically say, 50, million people are going to die or whatever, those clearly those have not yet been confirmed. But I think there is at least people making the parallel in the other direction. So what's your take on that?
Well, one thing is, the only positive I can see with all of this, I guess maybe one positive is we become more rationally prepared for pandemic type issues, because that is a category of thing that has long scared me. I mean, infinitely more than changes in climate conditions. Just the idea, and I just think of it because changes in climate conditions they're not purposeful threats. They're inadvertent threats. That is, it's the storm doesn't care about us. It's not trying to hurt us. But with these different kinds of viruses and bacteria, they're actually engineered. They're evolved to, they don't have an animus against us, but they survive at our expense. They're trying to survive and replicate, and that comes at our expense. So I'm particularly afraid of natural threats that are purposeful, deliberate threats. So that's just one thing, is more focus on those, I think is very warranted. So I would like to see that. But the only positive I can really think of besides that is that this is going to be how this plays out will be a really interesting illustration of how good different people's thinking methodology is and how our knowledge system works. And I'll be very interested, and I want to encourage people, whatever you've written on this, don't delete it. like let it stand, and I'm going to do it the same. And if I'm proven wrong about something, and it could, and I've posted a bunch on just my personal Facebook, which is, it's usually I'm posting it as, hey, here's an idea, I'm not sure about this. So I haven't posted much that's definitive, but even there I want to see, hey, where was I off and where was I right? Because I am suspicious of these doomsday scenarios. There's a lot that doesn't add up for me about them, and there's a really good article by, I can't pronounce, I don't know his name, his pronunciation, but John Iodinis, this Stanford guy, which we can link to, but he has some stuff just about how we don't know anything about the data. But I'm very skeptical of like these infinite accelerating doomsday type scenarios, but I'm really interested to see how that pans out. And it's unlike the climate issue, where it's a much longer term prediction and people are always changing their standards. So even when they predict millions or hundreds of millions of deaths due to climate and then it doesn't happen, then they can say, oh, well, but ice melted and that's really the problem. So there's this long term issue and then this ambiguity issue. Whereas with this, number of deaths by this will be a pretty good measure. And it'll be really interesting to see how people's methodologies look. Now, people will have different interpretations, I'm sure, and if it's not a catastrophe, people will say, "Oh, it's only because we did these measures." But I still think it'll be pretty easy to tease out who was thinking properly about it and who wasn't. And then in terms of the climate catastrophist, well, I mean, if people were to have a view, I mean, if I had a view that there's no such thing as a potential catastrophe, then they could claim vindication. But the whole point about criticizing climate catastrophism is the evidence is that there's not a catastrophe here. And in fact, overall, our safety from climate is something that's improving, which I've talked about a bunch, including because we have low-cost energy from fossil fuels that allows us to build like a more and more climate-proof environment. So the fact that somebody is right about one catastrophe does not mean that everybody is right about every catastrophe. I mean, the people who claim the, Mayan apocalypse, they're not vindicated because somebody would be right about this. Although, I would say that if the mainstream really gets this right, then they should be proud of themselves. But I don't think they're in any way getting the policy right because they're just not paying attention to the negatives of it. Of what their policies are. But it'll be really interesting if they're very wrong. So I treat it as, now people can consider this self-serving, but I think if there's a catastrophe, that just means there's a catastrophe. And if there's, I guess it would be interesting if all the people who are skeptical of climate catastrophe, if all of them said, oh, this is baseless, and then it was a catastrophe, then that would point out something about at least the people who did that methodology. Whereas mine is more, I'm pointing out, hey, the policies you're proposing are definitely catastrophic and you're not acknowledging that. And I am not at all. I have almost no I have no expertise on the science of the viruses, but I do have expertise on the science of human flourishing and what indefinite universal isolation does to it.
So
Next.
I have
Go
one
ahead.
point to add to that because
Go
I
ahead.
think the difference between policy and some like vague scenario is really important. It's not like we didn't spend billions and billions and billions of dollars into the healthcare system and agencies like the CDC. But what did we get from this, right? So we cannot ramp testing, we cannot ramp hospital beds, at least not fast enough. We cannot, like at least in Germany, I know we don't have the capacity to isolate even like elderly care homes, which would be important because it's a risk group. And so you could say, well, yeah, we should have prepared for this, but if the government makes all the wrong policies and wrong decisions, this doesn't help at all. So what would have been possible, what would have been possible with that amount of money if we would have known ahead what kind of viruses would have been, like what would have been an effective measure to take, like that the testing is really important and how to ramp that up and so on. So it's like in the analogy with the climate, like even if a doomsday scenario would be real, like people could say, yeah, we were right about that. Yeah, but have you been right about the policies? Because so what would have happened if we could have impoverished ourselves in the energy system like since the 1990s? What was prescribed? Where would we be? By the end of the 21st century, in a much poorer economy, much less prepared to something like sea level rise or extreme weather events and so on. So that's a different question. It's not like people can feel vindicated by vaguely saying, well, something's going to happen. Like you need to be very precise, and they make sort of a range of predictions that in itself is contradictory. Like it's a big difference whether we get like 3 degrees of warming or 6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, and certain amounts of sea level and so on. And so it's not like you can say, well, just trust the expert. Which expert, to what degree, what is he actually saying in terms of the range of possibilities, what's the reasoning and so on, and then translating into policies, that's even more complex.
Yeah, so I think of a lot of that as like their policy prescriptions have not been vindicated at all, and the policy prescriptions here have a bunch of overlap with their policy prescriptions, whereas they, one, it's ignoring the benefits of low cost energy, and the other, it's ignoring the benefits of, really people being free, but in particular, people being free to associate with one another in person, or you can think of it as freedom to socially interact. So in that case, there is a very negative parallel.